My name is Kristina Sárdi. I am International Communications Manager of the Danube Institute, and it is a great joy to welcome you all here tonight. If music be the food of love, play on, writes Shakespeare in Twelfth Night, and I think this is one of the best examples of how deeply music is rooted in our Western culture. In Hungary, musical education occupies an important place in the general curriculum, and thanks to the Kodály method, we do not just learn about music, but actively practice it in school from nursery to graduation. But what about other countries? Does music still hold a central place in Western history and culture? Tonight, our distinguished fellow, Mr. Michael Walsh, will answer these questions in his bracing lecture. Michael Walsh is an acclaimed author, a journalist, a gifted musician, and a screenwriter. He was for 16 years the chief music critic and foreign correspondent of Time magazine, for which he covered the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. His works include the novels As Time Goes By and All the Saints, which was the winner of the American Book Award for Fiction in 2004. Michael Walsh was a visiting fellow at Boston University, and he has lectured widely both in the US and abroad, including presentations in Tokyo, Munich, and here in Budapest. So without further ado, please join me in giving him a warm round of applause. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. Welcome, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. It's an honor to be asked to present two lectures here at the Danube Institute this year. And as some of you all know, I also gave two piano recitals last week of the music of Franz Liszt. So Liszt actually brings me to the topic of our conversation, since he's a famous Hungarian, and his influence is felt to this day in the city, in the names of buildings, in the name of the airport, as a matter of fact, with memorial plaques all over the place. And Liszt lived between 1811 and 1886, so his lifespan basically encompasses the 19th century, and that's what we're going to talk about today, which is the 19th century as the high water point, I think we can argue, of music and its influence on political and popular opinion. In the 20th century, music lost that place, largely as a result, I think, of the First and Second World Wars, and it became a kind of museum piece, certainly post-1945. And the repertoire that we hear today is largely that of the 19th century, with some 18th and even 17th century additions as well. So I want to start out by reading or giving you something to think about. And it's a series of names, and we'll see what they all have in common. Beaumarchais, Mozart, the French Revolution, Beethoven, Napoleon. What is the relationship among all of those names? Or if we want to move into the 19th century, because that's largely the end of the 18th, Count Gobineau, Father Jan, Wagner, World War I, communism, National Socialism, Hitler. The progressions are clear, from Le Mariage de Figaro, the play, to Le Nozze di Figaro, the opera, to the start of the French Revolution. and the fall of Louis XVI is a span of only 5 years. And yet in that time, the royal edifice was first lampooned, then sexualized, and then finally pulled down around the aristocrats' ears. Those with sensitive antennae, among them Louis XVI himself, who initially forbade the public performance of Beaumarchais' play. Only they could see what was coming. Most could not. In the same way, Arthur the Comte de Gobineau's theories of racial superiority were nationalized by Friedrich Ludwig Father Jan. He was not a priest, but the leader of the physical culture movement, Turnbewegung in Germany, nicknamed Turnvater, roughly the father of gymnastics, dramatized by Wagner, most notably in Der Ring des Nibelungen, adopted by Wagner's son-in-law, the Englishman Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and put into practice by Adolf Hitler, who said, "Whoever wants to understand National Socialist Germany must know Wagner." Hitler envisioned himself as staging Die Meistersinger in the real world, a celebration of holy German art, but brought only the epic destruction of Götterdämmerung instead. From the first deep E-flat pedal tone of Das Rheingold in 1854, the course of the next century was set and the world of its creator was doomed. Since the end of World War II, we have ignored the artistic canary in the coal mine at our peril because we no longer take art seriously. Certainly not as seriously as the Western world took it right up to the First World War, a world in which artists could change the course of history, and a mere ballet, like Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, could set off a riot in the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, as it did on May 29, 1913. 14 months later, that world vanished. Even closer to our time, can the triumph of the American civil rights movement be separated from the art that gave it birth? From Uncle Tom's Cabin to Kill a Mockingbird to the film Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Lincoln's famous remark to Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great big war." Maybe, alas, apocryphal, but it does not make it any less true. I think just from that list of pairings of names or sequencing of names, you get a sense of what I'm talking about. This picture illustrates it as well, that the art of these particular men, Mozart, Beethoven, and Wagner, cannot be separated from the world in which it was born and the world to which it helped grow and create. I sometimes amuse our audiences with the notion that, in my opinion, Mozart can only be understood, really, in the context of his time. And what was that context? We all know about Mozart, the little China doll who sat on Marie Antoinette's lap and cried when she wouldn't kiss him, who was toured around Europe like a performing monkey, a fate that befell Liszt, too, at a somewhat later age and a few years later. We think of Mozart as this bewigged person from the past, not a real human, not a passionate man, until we realize that his exact contemporary is the Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade's life extends beyond Mozart's at both ends. And as we know, the Marquis de Sade was a prisoner in the Bastille. And Mozart's opera, Marriage of Figaro, or really Figaro's Wedding is the more proper English version of it, helped bring that down. Now, how did that happen? First of all, Beaumarchais was a great playwright, and what he was communicating in his parody of the upper classes was expressly political without being political. Opera composers have always had this problem in the late 18th and throughout the 19th century. Verdi, for example, had to change the locations of some of his most famous operas, Rigoletto being perhaps the most famous, so that it didn't seem that he was celebrating the assassination of some important monarch. And remember that the 19th century was a century of assassination. We think that this is political assassination as being something rather novel, but of course it wasn't. And you all know that the Empress Sisi was assassinated by an anarchist as she was walking along the shores of a lake. This was unfortunately common throughout the 19th century, that people took out their political fantasies or their just craziness on prominent figures, and certainly the Empress was one of them, famous for her hair especially, and how much time she had spent every day having her handmaidens comb it and weave it, this famous long flowing locks of Empress Sisi. So how do we reconcile Mozart and Sade? It's actually easy if you listen to Mozart. But my contention is that we play Mozart all wrong, that we've left out the passion of Mozart. Now, I'm not the first to make this observation. George Bernard Shaw famously did so too. With Mozart left out, for example, he said of one performance, we tend to play Mozart as that fantasy of the little boy sitting on Marie Antoinette's lap. And yet the opera that he wrote wound up in her losing her head, in a bit of historical irony. But that's not true. From Mozart's letters, we know how passionate he was, how sexual he was. He wrote very, very, very explicit letters that would make the Marquis blush to his cousin, to whom he was attempting to become engaged. He wrote them not erotic letters, but what's the word I'm looking for? Just basically vulgar, very extremely vulgar letters to his own mother. And apparently this was a way that 18th century people communicated to each other, especially in German, which loves, as you probably know, this sort of scatological humor. So when I listen to Mozart, I hear the Sadean impulse in him. And I think it's because, as I mentioned, we play Mozart incorrectly. We play him too slow, for one thing. I was talking to my friend James Conlon, currently the director of the Los Angeles Opera, a man I've known for 40-some years now, about this. And I said, Jimmy, I think that we play 18th century music too slowly, and we play 19th century music too fast. I think, for example, we play Liszt too fast, and what I was attempting to do in the concerts that I was giving is to play lesser-known pieces by Liszt and not fast. That is to say, not showy. That these things eventually take on a life of their own. So as Mozart becomes the China doll music, and we listen to this kind of bloodless, dispassionate music without being able to project ourselves back into his world. What was his world? Well, it's not a world we'd want to live in, particularly. Buildings are cold, there's no indoor plumbing, carriage travel was onerous and harsh. It wasn't easy to get around. It was very hard to become socially mobile, obviously, in a highly stratified monarchical system, as was in place all over Europe during Mozart's time. And yet this young boy whose talent was so extraordinary that his father actually became his manager and took him everywhere in order to put money into the family coffers, and often sent Mama Mozart with him to kind of keep an eye on him. And Famously, Mama died while Mozart was a young teenager in Paris, and Mozart is writing letters home every day to his father, telling him how successful he's been, how much money they've made. They're obsessed with money. There's constant references to money. And even though he knows that Frau Mozart is dead, he doesn't have the courage to tell his father about this for days afterwards. And he basically says, oh, love and kisses, P.S. Mama died, basically. By the way, Mama died. So Mozart's letters give us an insight into the man, but Mozart's music actually tells us all we need to know about what a passionate thinker he was. First of all, we know he was a free thinker. The Marriage of Figaro is ostensibly about the mythological droit de seigneur, which gave the count the right of having the wedding night with the bride himself first before she went to her husband's bedroom. And this appears to be a complete fantasy, but it was kind of an accepted trope of the day. And The Marriage of Figaro is about Count Almaviva, who wants to sleep with Susanna, who is the betrothed of his manservant, Figaro. And so it becomes a kind of classic bedroom farce with transvestite roles. There's several of those in Mozart, and certainly later on in Strauss, in Rosenkavalier. Mistaken identities, all the things that animated people indulging in the sexual impulse of the day. And the audiences could laugh at it, because in the end, the Count fails. In the end, the Countess forgives him for his attempted infidelity, and the other pairs of lovers live happily ever after. As Oscar Wilde famously says in The Importance of Being Earnest, the good end happily, the bad unhappily. That is why they call it fiction. So in this case, it's fiction. Everybody ends happily. But if you look at Mozart's other operas, you'll see this obsession with this. He writes The Abduction from the Seraglio. Today we have our own issues with recrudescent Islam, and it was certainly a fixation of Europe. God knows you know that here in Hungary, well into the 17th century, well up to the siege of Vienna. The Abduction from the Seraglio is about a young swain whose woman is captured by the Turks and held in a harem, and he has to break into the harem and get her out. Again, that's a very common trope of the time, and well into the 19th century. Pornographic literature talks about the females in the Turkish harem. And it's true, and a crime that has largely gone unremarked or unavenged, certainly, that millions of women were taken from Europe and brought to the brothels and harems in North Africa. That Mozart could make a comedy out of it showed you that the threat had passed, but the awareness in the audience was still there. We move on to Così fan tutte, and what's that about? It's about two friends, and they're engaged to two sisters, and then comes an older, wiser, degenerate roue who says, women are completely fickle. That's what così fan tutte means. They all do it. That's the short translation of the Italian. He says, the minute you guys go out of town, they're going to cheat on you. And they say, no, not our women. They are faithful, and they sing famous a duet about how faithful their women are. But they take the bet, and they go out of town, and they come back in disguise as Albanians. This was, again, a trope. So they're from some vaguely Muslim-esque country like Albania, and they wear mustaches. And of course, the women can't tell them apart. They don't recognize them at all. And each boy then attempts to make love to the other girl. So the opera throughout, we're watching the unpaired couples falling in love with each other. And it's only at the very, very end, when they're about to get married, each man to the other guy's girl, that Alfonso reveals this deception and often in stagings, you'll see he'll turn their heads back so that they wind up with the right partner. Like the three great Mozart operas, this opera has a libretto by Lorenzo da Ponte. Lorenzo da Ponte was a great writer. He was a Jewish convert to Catholicism who later became a priest. He also writes Don Giovanni for Mozart. What's that about? Well, it's about Don Giovanni attempting to seduce a series of women, in which he fails. Throughout the opera, Don Giovanni strikes out with every girl in the opera, which is part of the comic undertone of what's deeply tragic and dark piece. Da Ponte, interestingly, finished his life, died in New York City, and he was the first professor of Romance languages at Columbia University. So Da Ponte gave Mozart three great librettos, and each one is about some form of sexual infidelity. And it's clear that obsessed Mozart. He writes to his wife. Mozart himself attempted, first of all, to marry his cousin, and that didn't work out. And then he fell in love with a daughter of a well-known family, and she turned him down, so he moved on to the next daughter in the family and finally got lucky, so he married her. They lived a hard life. Mozart wasn't completely a pauper. He was quite successful, and his letters tell you how successful his operas were, especially in Prague, which was a city that loved Mozart. But a lot of times they spent apart, and he's always writing to Constanza, saying, now, I've heard rumors that you're with other guys, and you really have to behave yourself in public, and please don't do this, et cetera, et cetera. So again, sexuality consumes him. We know that Beethoven, too, is motivated by these same elements. Mozart believes in political freedom, and he believes, is animated very strongly by sexuality. Beethoven, we know, believed in political freedom. He was outspoken about it. He was a fan of the French Revolution and a passionate admirer of Napoleon until Napoleon declared himself emperor of the French. And famously, Beethoven was working on the Third Symphony, the Eroica Symphony, and we still have the paper, furiously scratches out the dedication to Napoleon and writes instead, to the memory of a great man. And again, in one of those little historical ironies, while the Eroica Symphony is being premiered in 1804, I think it was, right around then, Napoleon is shelling Vienna. And in fact, there are Napoleonic soldiers in the audience listening to the premiere of the Eroica Symphony, which was about about Napoleon, but is now to the memory of a great man. Beethoven was unlucky in love. He never married. He died relatively, not as young as Mozart. Mozart was 35, almost 36 when he died. Beethoven was 57. We know that his attraction for women was very strong, although it didn't seem to be reciprocated by the women in question. He writes a famous letter to the so-called immortal beloved, in which he pours out all of this passionate attachment he feels to this woman. And we don't know if she ever saw it. We don't know who she is. It's been a guessing game for hundreds of years. Who was the immortal beloved? There was a movie made about it with Gary Oldman as Beethoven called Immortal Beloved. And I understand now from the Hungarian director, Lónyay-Hatvany, that he's about to do a movie about Beethoven and his relationship to a couple of Hungarian girls that has gone unnoticed by history. Beethoven's influence on everybody in the 19th century is without parallel. And again, I come back to this point that we don't think of musicians as being particularly influential. But Mozart was the most famous man in Europe at the time he lived. Beethoven was considered by everybody to be the greatest composer of maybe all time, but certainly among the living composers. And at his funeral, it was attended by everybody in the world. huge crowds showed up for it. You can't imagine that happening today, a contemporary composer like Beethoven. And his political ideas, he eventually reconciled himself to Napoleon somewhat, and as he went deaf, he turned inward. He couldn't hear anything at all in the latter half of his life except sort of noise in his head. And as a result, his music went into places where, like they say in Star Trek, no man has gone before. The last 5 piano sonatas, the last handful of string quartets, the Ninth Symphony, which isn't all that late compared to the piano sonatas and the late string quartets, demand things of musicians that no one had ever demanded before. They were considered unplayable, the last 5 sonatas, some of them, until Liszt got his hands on them, since he could play literally anything, and he was the first man to play the Hammerklavier Sonata in public. Wagner. Impossible to think of the 19th century, as I said, to Wagner, because he has indulged and ingested himself with these theories of Count Gobineau and Father Jan about racial purity and racial supremacy. He becomes infatuated with the idea of writing a vast epic, which became the Ring of the Nibelung, on this very subject. And of course, the Ring has been interpreted subsequently as an allegory of just about everything in the world. But at my concerts last week, I played the Wagner piano sonata, the sonata in A flat, which no one ever plays. Wagner's not a great writer for the piano. He's not famous for his piano music, and he finds his real métier in the orchestral accompaniment and of his music dramas. But this particular piece he wrote because he'd fallen in love with this young wife of a man who had been his supporter. And in order to express his desire for her, he pours it into this 15-minute piece, which resembles Beethoven in many ways. It resembles one of Beethoven's sonata in A flat, which opens with theme and variations. Very similar theme to the Wagner piece. But what's interesting to me was, certainly in the context of my Liszt lecture, that Wagner was Liszt's son-in-law. He married Liszt's daughter eventually. And also that in this piano sonata, we hear the pieces that are going to make Wagner great later, specifically Tristan and Isolde. And what is that about? Another forbidden love affair. Isolde is the queen of an Irish princess, and she is suddenly betrothed to King Mark of Cornwall, and Tristan is sent to Ireland to basically kidnap her and bring her back to forcibly be married. And the two of them, of course, fall in love. Her maidservant feeds them both a special love potion. Love potions figure in Wagner constantly. And they fall in love and they become illicit lovers. And the tragedy of Tristan and Isolde is, of course, that they can never consummate their love, that it is their tryst famously in Act 2 is broken up. Musically, it shatters you because you expect to hear this giant climax, and it doesn't come until the end, when Tristan, who's been mortally wounded, dies at his castle in France, in Brittany, and Isolde dies over his body. So you see these themes all come back. Each composer is kind of writing the same music. And it's this combination of sexuality and political philosophy that animates the entire 19th century. It wasn't just music, of course, it's literature. So to go to the end of the 18th century, Goethe writes a book called The Sorrows of Young Werther. And in that story, Werther falls in love with this village girl, but she is betrothed to an older, more established guy who has money and property. And so she marries this fella. And Werther finds this impossible to accept. And the novel ends with him committing suicide, shooting himself in the head on Christmas Eve, of course, and her Charlotte, the girl, finding his body as he lies dying. It seems like a silly story to us now. It caused an outbreak of suicides across Europe. Young men, unlucky in love, killed themselves because they had read this book. It's later turned into an opera by Jules Massenet, a French composer, one of the best operas ever written, and so effective because he feels this spirit of frustrated attraction for the lovers that it comes through in the music. I've spent the last 20 years in and out of Hollywood writing movies, and one of the main rules of writing movies is keep the lovers apart as long as possible. That is, you want that audience to root for them, and yet you have to frustrate their desire constantly until you get to the end. There's very little difference, as you can see, between comedy and tragedy. You could make their terror comedy if you wanted to. She rushes in at the end and leaves her husband, and he doesn't shoot himself, and they run off to Switzerland together, or whatever. That's how much power that one book had. Later on in the early 19th century, a French author named Senancour writes a book called Obermann, Obermann. And Liszt reads it, and he's struck by this book. He's consumed by it. He's largely an autodidact, so he's taught himself almost everything he knows. And in Obermann, which is the sort of, it's kind of an epistolary novel in that the main character is writing letters to his friend back in France because he's now gone to Switzerland, and he's now completely entranced by the Alps and by the majesty of beauty of the scenery, and he feels this soul longing for this. Again, we don't have much that's transcendent in our culture. While it's certainly true to say that from the time the Greeks on, every generation has said, the kids today are useless. But it's actually true in this particular case. And so it's hard for us to believe anyone would be that emotionally involved. It's a mountain, for God's sakes. But it was not just a mountain. It was the mountains. It was the freedom. It was from the dirty cities of Europe to the little Swiss villages, to even the cities like Geneva, which becomes so important during the 19th century. It's a whole transformative thing. So in the 19th century, as I mentioned with Father Jan, who invented this thing called Turnen, both of my daughters were raised in, either born or raised in Germany, and German's their first language, and they would talk about Turnen all the time, and I had no idea what they were talking about, but it's actually gym class. So this famous Turnvater, Father Jan, creates this physical culture movement in Germany, which still echoes today, perhaps less so than it did during the years that I lived there. But it has to do with outdoors and health and marching around. And as you know, Germans love to march around, sometimes in an unwelcome sort of way, but they march. That becomes a very 19th century trope. And so Liszt reads this book and goes, oh my God. And without going over the whole story of Liszt and his illicit romances with two married women, starting with the Countess d'Agoult, he meets Marie d'Agoult, who's the 29-year-old wife of an older French count, at a salon, and where he is the young, very handsome, very charismatic man. She falls in love with him on the spot. And a few months later, she's pregnant, and they are on their way to Switzerland. They abandon everything in their selfish pursuit of passion and desire and the freedom that nature offers them. So every one of these composers become entranced by nature, transfigured by nature. And Liszt writes a piece called Obermann, the Ballet of Obermann, Ballet d'Obermann. It appears in the first book of the Année de Pèlerinage, Years of Pilgrimage, which he wrote while he was cavorting with Marie all over Europe. And it becomes one of the pivotal pieces of 19th century piano literature. I played it last year, and I'll probably put it back into my repertoire. It's a stunning piece of music because it takes you through all of these emotional states. I hate this life. I hate everything about it. I'm going nowhere. What's going to deliver me from this monotony and this misery? And it's nature. It's physical love. It's a woman. It's an insight into the meaning of life, effectively. And all three of these guys have that. All of this music is animated by those desires. And that music has become bloodless today, certainly since 1945, with the triumph of the so-called 12-tone school of Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern, even though there's some great music that came out of it, but it doesn't resonate with you, the audience. And it's why audiences fell off so precipitously. It's why music became stultified, that Mozart and Haydn became sluggish, and orchestras were too big for them and too rich in sound, because remember, the orchestra that Mozart wrote for has nothing to do with the Berlin Philharmonic today. That people lost their belief in its transformative power. It became the thing you go to. What's at the Philharmonic tonight? Well, there's an overture by Rossini, and then there's a piano concerto by Mozart, and then there's the Brahms Third Symphony, Go Home. And everyone's heard all these pieces 1 million times. So they don't do anything for you. It's just, I really like that. And then you become enmeshed in performance criticism. As a slight digression on that, I started as a music critic when I was 23 or 4 years old. And I looked around at all my very well-known colleagues in the business and said, I will do this for 25 years, and then I will quit, because I will have heard everything, and I don't want to be 80 years old sitting there listening to the Beethoven Fifth for the 10 millionth time and having to write about it. And what's left for me to write about? Hey, it's a great symphony. No kidding, right? I didn't like the part where, and you specify some flub in the horns. You become a performance critic. So now you're not reviewing the music, you're not talking about the things that made that music famous in the first place, you're talking about performances. So it's a very, very bad thing. And it's too bad, because that's what's become of our music scene. Music is also national identity. As Europeans, you know this. Hungarians have their own national music, some of which was confused with gypsy music. So, for example, the Liszt Hungarian Rhapsodies we know are not Magyar melodies, they are gypsy melodies. And he knew that too later on. And certainly coming after Liszt, Bartók, and Kodály find this out and really become instrumental in the recovery of Magyar music and its use in the 20th century. Smetana writes Ma Vlast. Obviously, the Germans have a stranglehold on musical nationalism. The Brits adopt it too. And the French go their own way, but there's very distinctive French sounds, distinctive way, just as when they speak or sing, there's a distinctive intonation, and it's very hard for foreigners to get that. So a lot of these performances became specialized by members of the national ethnic community for which they were written. But it gave the countries purpose and identity. Now, we live in the identity politics era, in America especially. This happens. What is my identity as an American? Well, I would say this. Growing up, I had an unusual childhood. Growing up, we were Marine Corps kids first, number one. 2, we were Catholic. 3, we were Irish. But Irish came third. Most Americans obviously don't grow up in the Marine Corps, where you move every 2 or 3 years. So I grew up in California and in Hawaii and in Washington, D.C., and I've lived all over the world since then. I just have been unable to break the naturalness of going to a new environment. And I love the challenge of doing that. But identity is very important right now, and it's become racialized, and it's become ethnicized, and it's become misused in multiple different ways in the United States. And you see that fight going on. It's one of the things that underlies the Trump phenomenon, whether you're pro or anti-Trump. Nobody's neutral to Trump. So that is one of the things that the Americans are working out. But nations that lose their wills to nationhood soon enough lose their ways. Just ask what remains of the British Empire, which wavered with the passage of the 1933 Oxford Resolution. Now, this is 1933. They fought a war against their German cousins, and they're about to fight another war against their German cousins. And when I say cousins, I mean literally their cousins. That World War I and II were effectively a family battle of Queen Victoria's grandchildren. I think we all accept that now. But in 1933, the Oxford debating house passed the resolution that this house will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. So the Brits had become completely pacifistic and no longer attached to their royal family. Similarly, nations that never, for various reasons, had much of a will abandoned it quickly enough in the face of political correctness or the zeitgeist, whichever comes first. Ireland, on which I spoke 2 days ago, is a good example. One of the most oppressed nations on earth enjoyed less than a century of independence and freedom from the Easter Rising of 1916 to its joining the European Union in 2009. At gunpoint, I might add. They voted it down, and then mom and dad came home, took the car keys, closed the liquor cabinet, and said, vote again until you get it right. So they got it right. An enforced history of forelock tugging has reduced the Republic to a colony of Brussels instead of London. So what do we need to do? How do we fix this? It's easy for me as a lifelong critic, although I did quit after 25 years, and I became a novelist, and then Hollywood called me, and I suddenly found myself in Los Angeles writing for movies and television. And then I most recently decided to start playing the piano in public again after about a 40-plus year layoff. And I make a living primarily as an author. So currently for St. Martin's Press, I've written 2 books on military history, and I now have a 3rd one that's due in March. What do we do? It's easy for me to talk. There's a famous musical book of exercises, etudes, called Gradus ad Parnassum, Steps to Parnassus, which means we start down and we go all the way up the top of the hill with these steps. But of course you have to build up strength and stamina and ability as you do so. We need a rediscovery of what got us here in the first place. I'm a great believer in history, obviously. I do that for a living. I spend a lot of time with primary sources. I ask questions. What does this mean? What did it mean to them? For example, I bet most of you were shocked to find out that Mozart and Sade are basically the same person. You wouldn't think of it, but it's true. You'd be surprised to find out that Napoleonic soldiers were sitting there listening to the Eroica Symphony at its world premiere. You wouldn't be surprised at all to find that Hitler was an honored guest at Bayreuth, welcomed by Frau Wagner herself, Liszt's daughter, who lived to be 1 million years old, well into the 20th century, and her son-in-law, Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Connecting the dots is so important, and I think it's the thing we have to pass on to our children, because hand-me-down bromides and shibboleths don't do it. Everyone has to come to his or her own philosophy or consciousness or reasoning, but you can't do it by osmosis. You have to do it the hard way. I worry about AI in this regard. I'm thinking about going back to teaching for a little bit. And I said to some of my prospective colleagues, what do we do now? Students just go on AI and give you a paper. And it's easy to tell that it's written by a robot monkey, but it will get better with time. In fact, all of us published authors are in the middle of a huge lawsuit at the moment against an AI company that, without our permission, has fed our books into this machine to teach it how to write. So, paying me a grand total of $0, they've pirated my published works in order to teach this machine proper use of the English language, me and a million other people. So it's highly complex, but it's a real worry. So what would I do in a classroom? First of all, I'd ban cell phones. Second of all, I'd ban computers. And third of all, I'd have all tests taken right in front of me in handwriting. No more tech, because it's a shortcut to hell. And we have to be very careful about that. Without an understanding and appreciation of the culture we seek to defend, and I hope that I'm one of the foremost defenders of Western culture right now in the public square. In both domestic and foreign policy, the entire enterprise is fundamentally futile. A culture that believes in nothing cannot defend itself, for it has nothing to defend. Who's going to fight for something you don't care about? My first military history book was called Last Stands, and it's about battles in which one side gets wiped out. And the men know they're going to get wiped out. At some point in the battle, they realize this is it, we're dead. And whether it's the Spartans at Thermopylae, or Custer at the Little Bighorn, or my own father fighting at the Chosin Reservoir in Korea in 1950 against the Chinese, it's worth fighting to the end. Not to understand our culture, or worse, to reject it out of hand in a rebelliously juvenile manner, is not to understand history and is not to understand politics, which is to say, it's not to understand ourselves. I'm very passionate about this subject because myself, I've had to learn this effectively on my own as a young boy, reading as widely and Catholically as I could, and I've continued that throughout my life as a musician to try to remove myself from the interpretation of the music and let the composer speak, so that it's not about the performance, but it's not about the technical performance, it's about the meaning of the music. How can I communicate to you what I believe to be true about this abstract thing? When you think about music, it's quite extraordinary. It's nonverbal. Liszt occasionally is explicit about what it's about. It's about a journey to Switzerland. It's about a lake. It's about the river, sitting by the bank of a river. Or not. What is the B minor piano sonata about? Nothing. It's been interpreted in many, many, many ways, but it is this miraculous piece of artistic construction. And let me tell you an epiphany I had last year when I was here. I went up to, as I always do, to Liszt's apartment off of Andrássy there, where the old conservatory was. And they've got many of his pianos, and they've got all sorts of things behind glass cases. And I saw a copy of the B minor sonata, and I looked and I saw it was the climax of the B minor sonata, which for me is a touchstone of every pianist who plays it. Will they get it right? It's hard to play Liszt, not technically. It's hard to know where the emphasis has to be. And at the climax of the B minor sonata, I've always felt it should go a certain way, that it should be big and you should slam right into it. And most music is played too unaggressively. Mozart for sure. But in any case, there was, behind a glass case, the climax of the B minor sonata, and it was a copy owned by one of Liszt's pupils. But Liszt has annotated it. And at that exact spot, Liszt says, yes, or something like that. Big noise here. I knew he was going to say that. It was like being a detective, and after 50 years of chasing him, I knew he did it. I knew what he meant. And it's right there in his hand, telling you, this is the high point. This is the top of the mountain. Now we're going to come down the mountain again. We've got a ways to go. But that's what it's about. When I listen to the end of the first act of The Magic Flute, not written by Da Ponte, but also one of Mozart's greatest creations, if the conductor slows down at the end of the first act, there's a little 8-bar, 16-bar orchestral section that ends that act. If he slows down, I know he doesn't understand the piece. I just know it. And there came into performances this Germanic heaviness about that, and you would hear the orchestra just slow, like it was dying, when it should hit the wall like a truck hitting a brick wall. Bam, stop. I think if we reanimated our performances, and this is something that would have to be done at the conservatory level, audiences would like music a lot more. They wouldn't just be sitting there saying, oh yeah, that was nice. Oh, let's go have lunch or dinner, or let's go to bed or something. No, they'd be animated about the music in a way that you used to be animated about the cinema. We all know movies are bad now. They're real bad. They're written poorly. As a writer, I can see them clunking. They're poorly cast, with no stars, often with very unattractive people, in a historically implausible way. And the movie business is now having a crisis, having killed itself by suicide during COVID when it shut down the theaters. Audiences haven't come back. And we talk about this all the time. Why aren't they back? Because there's no movie stars. Why are there no movie stars? Because they're not making scripts that work anymore. So I'll leave you with these thoughts. With music, whether it's Mozart or Beethoven or Wagner, the composer wants you to follow his argument. He wants you to give yourself over to the nonverbal pleasures of music. That is, the soul transformation, or the longing for love, or with Wagner, the longing for death, because you never want to be a Wagner heroine. She's going to die for sure. Almost like Puccini, who enjoys killing off his heroines, but Wagner just lets them expire slowly out of a broken heart. In order to feel that and not it be ridiculous, you have to feel it too. And I think one of the reasons Wagner has survived the company that he kept intellectually after his death is that music still does it. It still works. It's still magical. And that's what countries need. That's what we, as the inheritors of Western European civilization, speaking as an American who now lives part-time back in my own great-grandmother's birthplace in Ireland. Talk about closing the emigration circle. I've done that. It's something that we should hold precious, and that we should take care that it continues to exist, and that we should teach the younger generations that this is important. This isn't learn to code. This isn't, I'm going to get a tech job. This is who you are. And if you give that up, you're lost. You have nothing to defend. A country that has nothing to defend won't defend it, and it will give up. So let us go back to this whole notion of embracing the arts. We have plenty of paintings here in the villa. The arts of all kind, poetry, music, the things the Greeks prized the most. Remember that music was one of the four basic subjects that were taught in ancient Athens. It was part of the upbringing of every young citizen. We do have to go back to that, where that started. We do have to have music, and again, it's because this is a talk about music, that can transform you. One final example of this is Shostakovich, to talk about a relatively recent composer. wrote an opera in 1934, was premiered, called Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk. And it was so startling and so pornophonic, as one critic called it, that Stalin actually almost had Shostakovich killed. And it was withdrawn, and it was completely rewritten and Baudelarized to take all of the sexuality out of it, as Katerina Ismailova. And in the West, until relatively recently, that's how we saw that opera. But to listen to the real score of Lady Macbeth is to hear the most startling depiction of passion and love and desire and crime. And it's a murder story, it's a love story. It ends terribly, tragically with the suicide of the heroine. But Pravda said this: from the first minute, the listener is shocked by deliberate dissonance, by a confused stream of sound. Snatches of melody, the beginnings of a musical phrase, are drowned, emerge again, and disappear in a grinding and squealing roar. To follow this, quote, music, unquote, is most difficult. To remember it, impossible. Well, that's not true. Passion is here supposed to be expressed by noise. All this is not due to lack of talent or lack of ability to depict strong and simple emotions in music. Here is music turned deliberately inside out in order that nothing will be reminiscent of classical opera or have anything in common with symphonic music or with simple and popular musical language accessible to all. So let me just end with this anecdote. When I went to Russia for the first time in 1986, I went with the great pianist Vladimir Horowitz. And as a result, we were persona non grata because the U.S. had bombed Gaddafi in Libya, literally while we were in the air. So Gaddafi of Libya, being a Soviet ally, was the Soviets were not happy about this, and they caused us some trouble, and we were, of course, accompanied everywhere by various KGB people. But for my sins, I got to know the Tikhon Khrennikov, who was the head of the Soviet Composers Union. And Khrennikov invited me to lunch at the Soviet Composers Union, and I went in and sat there at this big table, and on the walls, the room was about this big, and this long table. On the walls were portraits of Prokofiev, Shostakovich, other Soviet composers. And Khrennikov was going to come to the United States on some kind of goodwill tour. This is 86. And I thought I'd get off to a good start by asking him the following question. I said, Mr. Khrennikov, how can you sit here surrounded by portraits of men you personally tried to have murdered? Well, you can imagine how well that went off. I turned to my Russian translator, who was under the table at that point, realizing it was death for him no matter what he said. And I said, go ahead, say that. So Khrennikov finally got the translation. Now, I asked Khrennikov in German if he spoke German yet. Nine, he doesn't speak German. He doesn't speak English. He probably did speak both languages. But it was translated into Russian, and then Khrennikov looked at me, and steam started coming out of his ears. And he did a Khrushchev imitation where he started pounding on the table in front and got up and yelled at me and said, how dare you talk to me like this, you running dog of capitalism, whatever he said. And once the smoke cleared, I said, because, Mr. Khrennikov, when you come to the United States, that's the first question you're going to get. And I wanted to prepare you for it. After that, he was my best friend. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate your attention, and let's open the floor to questions now. Shall we do that? Thank you.
So, thank you, Michael. You gave us a lot to think and talk about. And as you said, we are opening the floor up to questions. But first, I also have a question. It was very interesting the way that you yourself connected all the dots. And I wanted to come back to the last part of your lecture, and I wanted to ask this tendency that you talked about theaters, movie theaters being empty, and so on. Is it because we stopped feeling? And is it so that's why everything is bad, because we stopped feeling and because we stopped letting the power of the arts, the transformative power of the arts, change us?
I think we're becoming dehumanized. I think AI is a very great threat, very great threat. It's going to take your children away from you, and you'll never see them again. The problem, for example, in Hollywood, we talk about all the time, is the two screens phenomenon. Now that people don't go to the movies anymore, they watch it at home on streaming, so on Netflix or Amazon. But at the same time, they're on their phones. So that the motion picture business has decided that the way to keep their attention is to not give them much to think about, but to have an explosion or a sex scene or a fight or some catastrophe at a reliable interval of, say, 9 minutes. Seriously, because we count pages. When you write a script, I certainly do. You know what the overall length is going to be roughly, it used to be 120, now it's more like 110, and for a comedy it can be 96 or 98. It has a 1 to 2 to 1 structure. First act and third act are the same length. Second act is twice as long, so it's the equal in length, the acts 1 and 3, etc. It's like writing a sonnet. But they've abandoned that, and so as a result, they've given their audience a permission to be on their phone, texting or watching another movie on their phone or something. So we don't take it seriously anymore, and I think that's part of the problem. It's very hard to say shut it off. It's very hard to tell your children, I don't think you should have an iPhone until you're 65 years old, or whatever a reasonable number would be. So that's partly it. I live in sort of solitary splendor in the woods of Connecticut, surrounded by bears and deer and creatures that sometimes come in the door, possums, chipmunks, squirrels. What else have I got? Skunks, yeah, I mentioned skunks. That you don't want them coming in the door. Or bears either, they're very big bears. But I can shut the world out. There's no visible televisions. The house it was built in the 19th century, it looks like the 19th century is still going on. So I can lock myself in a room with my library. I have built an addition on the house, put a library there. I have 2 Steinway pianos that I'm never without access to a keyboard immediately. But that's obviously not for everybody. It's probably not even for me, but it's the way I shut it out. So I can concentrate on my work as well.
And so my other question is about the thing that you said that we should do, and we should fight until the end to stay connected and to connect the dots and to have a purpose and to have an identity. And you also talked about how music helped people in this matter. And so what do you think contemporary music, contemporary composers, classical music, or I would say semi-classical music, can help in this matter?
I don't think that, well, first of all, I'm out of the music business now, so I haven't been active in that scene for a long time. But I will say this, that in the 80s, I was a champion of the music of the minimalists. So Steve Reich, Philip Glass, John Adams. I've known John Adams since the day I started as a music critic in San Francisco in 1978. And a young man about my age came up to me and said, "Hi, I'm John Adams, I'm a composer. Here's my score." And I took it from him, and I've been a fan of John's ever since, and we've stayed friends. Philip Glass I've known since the late 1970s. I'm very pleased at his success, and they are doing his opera Akhenaten about the first monotheist, the Egyptian 18th dynasty pharaoh in Los Angeles. And if Phil's going to be there, I'm going to be there because he's 80, in his mid-80s now. But I want to be there near the end of his career because I knew him at the beginning of his career, and I thought this man has something to say. And his music was derided. It was, if you know minimalist music, it sort of sounds like needle stuck in the groove music or monotone, or it was very easily parodied and dismissed, but it's been very successful. So what it did was overthrow the Schoenbergian revolution. It made music tuneful again, for one thing, and it made it likable, and it made it hypnotic, and it made it transformative. And in the greatest of his operas, Satyagraha about Gandhi in Africa, and Akhenaten about the pharaoh, it takes you to just a whole new place. And we don't want to lose that desire to be taken to a new place. I miss the movie theater because from the time I was a little boy, I loved going into a dark room with this big screen that was going to show me something I've never seen before. And in fact, when I first came to Los Angeles, the producer who brought me there, who really taught me the business and produced a bunch of famous movies, said to me in his gruff way, "What have they never seen before?" That's when you start your script. What have they never seen before? That's how it works.
That is something to remember. So, any questions?
Please ask questions or comments or, yes, sir.
We have a microphone.
Oh, we have a microphone, even better.
I'm also an American, but Australian American. Lived around the world, and I want to know your comment on Budapest as a cultural center. And the reason why I'm asking that is, having seen, I was in San Francisco when you were, fantastic opera and different things like that. But what I have found here in Budapest is I found so many different interpretations of the music that you're talking about at an extremely high professional level where people are very committed to their art, as she was saying, from a young age, which I find actually every time I come to Budapest is very unique. So I can get a lot of different interpretations. I don't want to be the critic like you say, but on the other hand, I find here their use of the instrumentation. They also explain a lot of things in advance. I don't understand Hungarian, but just your comment on what do you think about the cultural music scene here in Budapest?
Budapest has become one of the great cities of the world. There's no question about it, and you should be very proud of it. Hungary's always had a great Western musical tradition. The man who conducted the first recording of the Ring Cycle by Wagner was a Hungarian, George Solti. I happen to have known Ervin Nyíregyházy, of all people, who was born here. Obviously, he's Jewish, he's probably from Nyíregyházy family originally. Became the rival to Horowitz in the 1920s in New York. And then, out of reasons that I can only surmise, having known him at the end of his life, he decided to commit professional suicide and became an alcoholic and a bum. And he lived by sleeping on the subway, the Grand Central shuttle, which in those days never shut down. He eventually got married 10 times, but he was always very dapper. He spoke with a very strong Hungarian accent in English. And I discovered him living in San Francisco in 1978. Not that I just ran into him and knew it, but I got a tip that the famous Nyíregyházy was living in the Skid Row of San Francisco, the Tenderloin. And I went down and I found him, and I wrote the story, and it became a national news, and he got a whole career revival out of this, which I was very pleased to see. But he was Hungarian. Ormandy was Hungarian. George Szell was Hungarian. The Hungarian tradition in Kocsis, Zoltán Kocsis, pianistic tradition, it's preserved the best of the old Austro-Hungarian culture of the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's one of the most attractive cities in Europe, and it will become, I think, increasingly a tourist destination as the word spreads. So you have to learn how to handle that, because as Venice finds, you can't really be overrun by tourists. But it's great. I love Hungarian musicians. I like playing with them. It's terrific. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Right, there's one right here. Right.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting, and
Thank you.
the reason why I'm here because I found this constellation of those three composers unusual, and you have pointed out the relation between Mozart and Beethoven, like political freedom, also love, sexuality.
Yes.
And also there's a clear connection between Beethoven and Liszt. You have this problem of romanticism, where to go after Beethoven. You have Brahms and this fight of schools, as I know. So what my question is about, what is the relation between Wagner and Mozart? I don't have any knowledge about any historical or musical influence of Mozart to Wagner. Can you explain those two?
Yeah. First, I'll say that there's a legend about Liszt. We know he was presented to Beethoven at one point. Beethoven's deaf, so he can't hear anything. But there's a legend that Beethoven gave him the Weihnachtkuss, the kiss of dedication at a public event, which is probably not true, but it was instrumental for Liszt in building his own legend that I am the inheritor of Beethoven's mantle. So I'm thinking of Mozart in this series of composers as one mantle to the next, to the next, to the next. That's the way classical education is conducted. All pianists, and I mean really, really good ones who perform, will say, I'm a fourth generation Liszt student or a fifth generation Leschetizky. And like in the Bible, so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat me. And they trace their lineage back via education. So listen, Mozart's operas are the first and the oldest operas in the repertoire. So he creates the idea of popular public theater that people will pay money to go see.
German speaking.
What's that?
German speaking. He was the first who has made.
Yes, well, he wrote in German partly. He wrote in Italian, of course, for the. But Seraglio and Magic Flute are both in German. And then later on, that encouraged composers like Janáček to write in Czech, because they were so dominated by the German theater, they felt they had to write in German. He said, I want to write in my own language. And I think Wagner oppressed people, but he liberated people too. He's a very complex character, obviously. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Thanks for the talk. According to people like Ted Giola on Substack, pop music died when Clear Channel consolidated all of the American music stations.
Uh-huh.
And you get one people choosing the playlist for all of the stations instead of each town's local station competing to break local artists. That's pop music. What has happened to classical music? Where is somebody like the new Philip Glass working as a taxi driver in New York at the moment? And how are they going to break through? Because it's a big contrast. Everything's been squeezed corporately, but on the other hand, anybody can get on YouTube and market themselves, but nobody seems to want to do that.
Well, this is a brave new world, and one I'm glad I'm not in, actually, because there is no traditional path to anything. As corporations have squeezed creativity, which is their natural, it's not like they're evil, it's just what they're built to do. I was watching a video today by the guy that invented Patreon, and he's complaining about the algorithm having squeezed the creativity out of places like Patreon, where, in case you don't know, it's a service for individual artists to promote their own work. And anybody can get on YouTube. Lightning probably won't strike, but you can get on YouTube. So there's a dispersal. As a journalist, I've watched the internet chew up all of my industries. Newspapers have vanished, for example, where once, if you were a newspaper man, your apartment or your house had papers stacked this high. It was a never-ending supply of newsprint that you weren't even going to read, but you did. I've watched them kill my own magazine, Time Magazine, when it became, we don't need a weekly digest of news anymore. We have, the phone can tell you what happened 2 seconds ago. But the downside of that, I think, is terrible, which is the internet. I started with Andrew Breitbart, I should say, that Andrew Breitbart, and some of you will know who he was a revolutionary who decided to offer an alternate to the mainstream media. And I had come from the mainstream media. And it became quite successful. And then Andrew died of a heart attack in 2012. His vision has been realized. The mainstream media has been effectively destroyed. But the result is this sort of open sewer of nothing. That yes, anyone can publish literally anything and put it on the internet, but unless you have Musk's algorithm, you're not going to see 99.99999 impossible percentage of what's on there. So it just goes, the tree falls in the forest and it doesn't make a sound effectively. So paradoxically, at the beginning of the internet period, I could put up a story and it would get picked up by Matt Drudge, or it would get picked up by the Instapundit or some of these aggregating sites, and the traffic would go through the roof. It would sometimes close down websites. Now you can get a Drudge link and it doesn't matter. So there's really, this anomie is set in that nothing really matters. Exhibitionists post themselves on TikTok, and you just gloss over. The most startling pornography appears, and you go, okay, yeah, next. And we are unshockable anymore. The writing is so bad on most of these sites, and the content so negligible that I have told my younger colleagues, as I said in the movie business to my younger colleagues, how do you get a conservative movie made? And I said, don't write one. Write a good movie. Write a good movie first. And maybe once in a million times that will get made, and it will reflect its writer. You don't have to beat them over the head with it. So what I've decided to do in my old age is to go back to books, because they have meaning. Somebody approved this. Somebody paid me good money to write this book, and I share in the profits of that book, unless they steal it for AI, which we're dealing with. But I know that 100 years from now, the physical object will still exist. The internet will be just pouring garbage into the atmosphere, and you will have no way, except for the sites that you already like, to know what's new. And I think that's the worst thing about the algorithm. It gives you more of what you just want. So for example, recently I bought a pergola for the patio at my house in New England, because the porch, you couldn't really use the patio, but now it's got a roof on, it's lovely. So I bought that from Costco or Wayfair or something. Now what do I get? 1 million emails saying, do you want to buy another pergola? Well, why would I buy another pergola? I just have one, and it's sitting right there. It's perfectly good. Am I going to put a pergola on top of the pergola? Am I going to put it out in the backyard so the bears can enjoy it? I don't know. But that's what I get because I bought one pergola. So imagine this times literally everything that you do. You click on one site on Facebook, and you will get 1 million of those sites suggested to you 2 seconds later. And with Alexa, it's eavesdropping on you. You mutter the word whatever, and boom, in your email you'll get 10,000 offers for whatever the next day. The only way out of this is to shut it off. That means no Alexa, no Siri, no nothing. And I know that's a super Luddite position, but I don't care. I'm going to do it that way. There's a question.
was just curious, your comments about education. I taught high school advanced placement for 30 years. Do you take any solace in what's classical education that's just coming out of North America?
Yeah, well, I like St. John's University. You know, there's 2 campuses. They just study the great books. I can't speak to Europe. I've only ever briefly lectured in German at the University of Munich. Hillsdale College in Michigan. Dr. Larry Arnn is a good friend of mine. I've spoken there. I've been on cruises there to talk to their donors. And there's now something called the University of Austin, which again is back to basics. I think that's really good. And I would like to teach at a place like that where we just learn to read, right? We don't deconstruct the text, we learn to read it in as many languages as we can manage. Because I'll just say this en passant, languages are so important. Because when you speak one, that's it. When you speak 2+, a whole new world opens up to you. Different idioms, different feelings, different emotions, different ways of saying things. Sometimes it's easier to say it in another language than your own because the phrase is better, or it's more important, or it's more apposite. So I would teach, I was offered directorship at various music schools at one point in my career. Or journalism schools, journalism schools. And I said I wouldn't teach journalism at all. You can teach a monkey to be a journalist. I'm a good example of that. I was a monkey, and 3 months later I was a journalist. So if it can be done with me, it can be done with anybody. But I would say, read, take languages. One of the things that helped me immensely was learning German in college from 2 great teachers. It wasn't homework, it was fun. And then I came, to Europe for the first time as a fresh-faced 20-year-old, and I couldn't wait to try out my fancy new, terrible German on the Germans. And they pat you on the head and then say something back to you in English, and you'd failed totally. It's not until they start talking back to you in their own language that you think you finally got something. So that's what I would say that to the journal, and I never got any of those jobs offered to me. Just get rid of the curriculum, teach the great journalistic writers like Martha Gellhorn and Ernest Hemingway, who were married for a while, as you may know. The great tradition of journalistic writing from Mark Twain on, and learn from it. It's there. There's this wonderful thing in Los Angeles. As though many of you know, Los Angeles is in the middle of a desert. LA itself isn't even on the ocean. It's miles from the ocean, and it has no water. So that was a problem. And so an Irishman named Mulholland was an immigrant to America, and he decided he would bring the water from the Owens Valley in the north of California, where it rains all the time, to Southern California, where it never rains. And they bought up farmland. This is the plot of the movie Chinatown, exactly, partly. And they brought the water through via aqueducts and sluices, and he opened the sluice gate, and it flowed into the Pacific. And he said to the people of Los Angeles, there it is, take it. And that's what we have to do. We have to take what's available. We can't wait for it to be given to us. He made a lot of money, and he developed LA into the metropolis that it became. But I just loved that directness. Culture's there. Take it. Read it. No one's going to stop you. We're not in the Soviet Union anymore. And I had enough of the Soviet Union to last me a lifetime. I was very privileged to be there from, Chernobyl blew up when I first got there, and the Soviet Union collapsed a couple of weeks after I left. So I kind of got to see, and East Germany too. I was in Berlin when the wall came down. In fact, I have a big chunk of it in my living room that I personally hammered out with a sledgehammer, and I was very glad to do so. We don't live in a repressive society. We live in a society that's open, and we just have to take advantage of it.
Thank you. We have time for one last question.
Lady in the back.
Well, I think I have the cure for humanity. But I'll start by saying who I am and why I'm here. I'm American. I've lived here for almost 10 years. I'm a music critic. I have a column on papageno.hu, and I criticize classical music performances.
Welcome to my old world.
I'm here because there are 16 professional symphony orchestras. I'm from New York. We have one. I lived in San Francisco. I sang with the San Francisco Opera. We have one symphony orchestra there. Of course, there's an opera orchestra too. But this is a gold mine of music here. And the reason why it's so flourishing and so thick with options, you can find any kind of music here, but the classical music is par excellence here. The reason why it's so wonderful is that every person that I have met who's older than around 25 has learned the Kodai method in school. Everyone. Now I hear, unfortunately, that it's been pulled out of a lot of curriculums, so that's unfortunate. But I'm convinced that society will be forever changed for the better if every child learns music. Every child, even if they're deaf, it doesn't matter. They can pound on the floor. They can still get rhythm. This would change everything. It would revolutionize humanity if every single child studied music, but it doesn't require the internet or a phone. It requires their hands and their brains and maybe a couple of sticks, a drum, a musical instrument. That's the cure.
Well, I think that's absolutely true, and thank you for that comment. I mentioned languages earlier. Music's another language. You know, we look at a page, a score, and if you don't know how to read music, it's as foreign as Chinese or Greek or ancient Greek. If you do, it's just another language. You go, oh, okay, right there, boom, this is how it goes. I think giving kids languages is really important, but music is universal in that sense. Certainly Western culturally universal, and now universal in places like China, Korea, and Japan as well, which are turning out great performers all the time. Give them the opportunity to do something other than what they already know. And that's the evil of the internet. It reinforces what you already know, and it shuts down your curiosity. So I'm in favor of that. Thank you all for coming. Our time is up, and I greatly appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you.